definition of metaphor, which, by the way, is the original definition of persuasion. Right? So, in fact, you could say etymologically that persuasion and tropology are quite connected. Even if, so in the European tradition, the contemporary European tradition of rhetoric that sees metaphor as or sees rhetoric as the study of tropes, metaphor being, I'm going to use metaphor like he does here as synonymous with all tropes, right? So in other words, we're not distinguishing between different types of figures of speech. We're saying, as Aristotle does, here's one right here, that metaphor is, insofar as it's concerned with semantic transport from one place to another, is the general type of figure. Now we can make distinctions about, well, simile has the word, all the usual distinctions people make, but I'm using the term, and he's using the term metaphor in that most broad sense of figures of speech. When in the European tradition one is talking about rhetoric as a study of metaphor, it is usually what gets located in our tradition as a post-Ramus or post-Enlightenment. Peter Ramus is the guy that basically says, so in antiquity, rhetoric was composed of 5 canons. What are they?
Convention, arrangement, style, memory, and delivery.
Peter Ramus, and Ramus is a figure for this. It's not like one guy caused something, massive like that. But effectively, what Ramus does is say, well, this is the job of dialectics, and actually, arrangement should simply follow the logical procedure that one sets up, which means you don't really have to memorize it, and delivery doesn't matter because we're now talking about writing. And so, really, the only thing that matters about the study of rhetoric is style. So, basically, post-16th century. In Europe, rhetoric becomes equal to the study of style. Hence, there is a deep historical connection in the European tradition between rhetoric and poetics. The belletristic movements in the 18th and 19th century actively took on the terminology of rhetoric. Now again, rhetoric in this sense, rhetoric as style, rhetoric as tropes. So by and large, when one is talking, or in that European, that one is that Damon and others are responding to this sense of rhetoric as being equal to style. Now, what you get taught, and what we teach our students, is that style is one element of rhetoric, right, that has all of these other attributes. But for instance, Damon will say that persuasion is a derivative form of rhetoric, that style as, metaphor as style is the more originary. We can talk about that. That was my way of saying we're definitely not going to talk about that. Okay. Does that make sense? That is the phrase, that's the moment of pedagogy, because I'm going to say that like 17 times every class. Does that make sense? And then you guys are supposed to say nothing and I just continue on. Okay. In order to make sense of Derrida and post-structuralism more generally, you got to know something about structuralism. So I'm going to give you a primer on structuralism, and specifically structuralist linguistics. So when Derrida writes in Structure, Side, and Play, something has happened in the history of structure that we might call an event, but we're not the purpose of structuralism precisely to reduce such a thing. I think that's almost verbatim, isn't it? That's scary. Okay. The event that he wants to mark out is when, as he says, language invades the universal problematic. What that means, he points to particular figures, Nietzsche, Heidegger, Freud, but what that means in practice is the emergence of structuralism in Europe occurs when Saussurean linguistics gets taken up as a fundamental analytic, conceptual analytic for all modes of inquiry. So, for instance, Levi-Strauss is an anthropologist. Levi-Strauss is an anthropologist who organized the study of culture through Saussurean linguistics. Okay? And I'm going to give you Saussurean linguistics in just a second. One cannot, I don't believe, overstate the influence of Saussurean linguistics on 20th century Western thinking, academic thinking, not just people thinking, that stuff. Almost everything that you think of as being sort of postmodern comes from a response to Saussure, whether it knows it or not. And Saussure never even published it. This is his lecture notes that one of his students published. So he didn't get a lot of money out of it. Kind of sucks. So this form of structuralist linguistics migrates into a whole series of other terrains: anthropology, literary studies, sociology, the social sciences, and that's exactly the problematic he's interested in here. Is like what happens when linguistics moves into the social sciences. Can that happen well or not? And thus forging what becomes structuralism in France for roughly 40 years, and is then imported to America in 1966 or 67, I can't remember the Hopkins conference, at which Derrida presents this essay, Structure, Side, and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences. At the same time that Lacan is presenting Roland Barthes. Barthes is, sorry, it's fun to say it like that. Barthes, Lacan, like, basically what happens is in the late 60s in America, America imports structuralism, or tries to import this intellectual movement that's going on in France called structuralism. And what happens is it gets post-structuralism at the same time and can never really quite distinguish which is which. And so the history of structuralism and post-structuralism in this country is very muddied, such that what I will describe to you as structuralism is going to sound a lot like Pomo hipsterness, as some of it is. And some of it is not. There's structuralism that's more or less scientific, structuralism that's more or less committed to infinite signifying play, for instance. Okay. That's why Derrida will begin to say something like an event has happened in the concept of structure. Right? If it weren't the whole point of structuralism to reduce an event to its structure. Right? Among the problems with structuralism, well, I don't want to give you too much structuralism. I still want to have a class. Structuralism's concern with structure is very good at offering what it will describe as a synchronic view of the state of anything, let's say language, at a particular time. And it therefore understands diachrony. These are the terms that it introduces. Synchrony means at one time, diachrony means across time, right? The way it understands diachrony is like a linear series of synchronies. This is one of the critiques. Is that it doesn't really seem to get change very good. And hence is forced into this notion of rupture or break as the explanation for how you go from one structure to another structure. Just like crazy shit happens. There's a break of some kind. You see this. So this is one of the targets in the third to last page where Derrida says there's a tension between play and history, and hence one comes up with this. This is a critique of structuralist commitment to synchrony. You can see the structure of a system at any particular time. This comes from Saussure's distinction, analytic distinction, is between, well, there's actually three terms, but just in popular usage. Langue and parole. The question he begins his linguistics with, which is what is the object of study of linguistics? What is it? Guess. Language. What the fuck does that mean? Edit that out. There'll be no fucks on that camera. What does that mean? I mean, what do you look at, right? Like it's an actual analytic question. So okay, language is my object of study. So what do I look at?
Structure and how to communicate.
That one possible option is the structure of the language at any given time. Where's that?
It's in textbooks.
Textbooks. Textbooks are one place where it gets concretized. I mean, this is a real, like, Saussure's like, where is the structure of the language? Well, his answer is, it's everywhere and nowhere. Right? It's in all of your heads in a certain sense, but it's not in anyone's head. Right? But more importantly, what it's not is parole, which is what?
Utterance.
Actual speech acts, what people actually say, what they write, so this is actual action. This is event. This is structure. For sheerly pragmatic purposes that are completely understandable, he's like, you can't study these things. Why not?
Because they're gone.
They're so heterogeneous, you can't keep them. I mean, even if you can record, you can't record all of them, right? So what you have to do is, based on these things, you formulate this. Seems reasonable, right? So the game of structuralism in that sense is to study from a heterogeneous enactment, which is, he'll completely acknowledge that's what there is. What there is people speaking and writing. We will extract a system that has rules. And what we will study then is that system. So what one gets is one gets a structure at a certain time in a certain culture, and then a structure at another time in a different culture, you know what I'm saying? So one has a series of synchronies. That's where structuralism is very good at presenting, presenting structure, right?
Oh, I was just going to ask, can you think of that in a similar way as like a relationship between practice and theory?
Yeah, I mean, you can. So because one of the critiques could easily be, here's the danger that Saussure undertakes, which is he says, okay, there really is no such thing as this. All we have to look at is this, but we can't look at all of this, and it's just too messy and too ephemeral. So we have to extract from it this idea that there's this thing. The problem is, we then pretend like this thing came first. That everyone is walking around speaking because they have this giant life. And this is, the structure of artificial intelligence is premised on precisely this type of thinking. Which is, you extract a series of generalizable rules from particular practices, and then you think that those generalizable rules were what caused the particular practice. Right? Nietzsche's going to be all over it, mistaking the effect for the cause. But that's one possible critique one can level at Saussure and at the movement of theorization itself. Is it the case that everybody's walking around? And Saussure will, to his credit, I'm not quite sure how to deal with this problem. This is a tough one, Okay. That's my 5-minute structuralism. Now linguistics. Study of language. It's made up of signs. Sign, everywhere sign. Okay, now just for precautionary purposes, recognize that people sometimes use the word sign interchangeably with signifier, so that they might use the word signifier to refer to the whole signifier-signified operation, or they might use the word sign to refer to the whole thing, or they might use the word sign to only refer to the signifier. Okay, so you have to be a little bit careful about how these terms get negotiated, but this is the general understanding. A sign, a linguistic sign, is composed of a signifier and a signified. What are signifiers and signifieds? Well, first, I shouldn't even phrase it in the form of questions. I should just say it. Because his model is predominantly oral, though not exclusively so, maybe. The signifier is a sound image. The signified is a thought image. Now, so sound image literally means the impingement upon your eardrum of the noise that I am making, right? And thought image literally mean the image that you form in your head. Now, before we get into more detail on signifier and signified, I should have started by laying out what it's responding against, which is the naming operation. We will call this representation. The idea being that language functions to represent things. Okay? 4 moments of representation. Perception, you see an object. Cognition, you form an idea of the object. Language, you speak, you put that object, that idea into words. And then lastly, this person represents the idea. You have represented the idea to them. You can't carry around trees everywhere, so you have to have a word for it. So tree, the word tree allows you to transmit your idea from point A to point B. Important attributes of this representational understanding of language is, first of all, the word has no influence on the formation of the idea in the first place. The formation of the word is external to the formation of the idea. Ideas come first here. What language is supposed to do then, what words are supposed to do, is to transport that idea from point A to point B intact, without changing it. Right? This is, I call this the FedEx understanding of language. Like, the job of language is to be the FedEx package and not let the thing inside get messed up at all, right? Like, it's to protect it. And all it does is move it from point A to point B so that, characteristic 3, there is ideally a one-to-one correspondence between the ideas that are formed at point A and point B. They are the same idea. What's the word? Triangle here. I guess I need the word for delta. It's change. I see change and then I just imagine it. Okay, well, one of the things that's important is, like, okay, abstract ideas become a lot fuzzier here. So it's one thing when you say triangle, it's another thing when it's justice. Right? Like, what is the idea of justice? And so the transport mechanism becomes more difficult. I mean, so traditionally, people recognize that the mechanism of adequately communicating something becomes harder as things become less concrete. And by the way, this is the question of metaphor, like the move from the concrete to the figural, which we'll get to explicitly in a bit. But in this sense, the concrete is more easily transmissible. And you see the incredible privileging of the concrete, the sensory origins of metaphor, right? The non-philosophical in Derrida's reading of the tradition. So language comes after the fact. Ideas simply pre-exist their articulation in language. Language is then FedEx. This is why you say to your students, you're writing, what you're trying to say is unclear, right? The language of clarity is because in this paradigm, ideally, words should be invisible. They should erase themselves, because the purpose of words is not words. The purpose of words is to transmit ideas. Ideas, what matters about language is not language. What matters about language is something else, ideas, that are formed prior to language and as a consequence of language. This is what Derrida last week and what we read calls the ideological version of, not because it's in the Marxist sense of ideology, but because it's driven by the idea. So really I'm laying out in diagrammatic form what we talked about last week with signified context, right? That the idea precedes and governs its articulation in language. One-to-one correspondence, transmission, FedEx. Okay. What Saussure wants to do here, first of all, is to say, thought prior to language is just a messy shit. That there aren't such things as well-formulated ideas prior to language. In some way, they are necessarily imbricated. Now, he doesn't necessarily do an incredibly good job of parsing out how they're imbricated. And so there are different ways of understanding this, but in a sense, you don't get one without the other. Now, the hardline version of this is not what Saussure would be like a linguistic determinism. And that's not what Saussure is doing at all. So a linguistic determinism of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis type, I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, what that says is that you can't have an idea unless you have a word for it. Right? So in that diagram, that diagram is the exact opposite of this diagram. It is to say one must have a word in order to even have an idea. So that's the extreme opposite. This is the extreme side of one must have an idea and then have a word, and then, whereas Saussure is kind of agnostic, like it's just like, look, they're together. Right? Signifiers and signifieds. But he is clear that one does not simply have an idea first. right? And that, in other words, in some way, the signifier is involved in the constitution of the idea. Not exactly sure how, but sort of, somehow, right? Okay. That's first issue. Second issue. What is the relationship between the signifier and the signified? By the way, this is the example that, the tree is the example that he uses, so I'm not just like obsessed with it. That is a tree, so don't make fun of my lollipop. Signifier, signified. What's the relationship between them?
There's no necessary relationship between the signifiers.
Yeah, the two terms that are important for Saussure are arbitrary and conventional. Arbitrary means there is no intrinsic reason why the word for this can't be car. Nothing. There's nothing about this thing that says we should call it rutabaga, you know, or anything else. So there's no intrinsic connection. There is, however, a very powerful extrinsic connection, conventional connection, meaning people have repeated tree for that thing for a really, really long time, and hence it's a tree. The interesting thing to consider here, though, for Saussure is that he'll say, like when you say that the connection, the relation between two things is arbitrary and conventional, that tends to make people believe that it's like, well shit, then it could be anything, right? Saussure says, in fact, no. That's what makes it impossible to change. Why? Arbitrary and conventional, that's like party time, right? I mean, that's everything's airy. Why would Saussure say no?
If there's no logic to why it's called that, then people are going to continue to call it what they already
That's
call it.
exactly right. Because the connection is arbitrary, there's no reason not to call it that. And everybody has been calling it that for a long time, so you're intervening in the force of habit, and reason doesn't beat habit. Right? Everyone's been doing this for a really long time. Well, let's start calling this car. I mean, we can decide to do that. We just simply won't be understood. Right? So that's fine too. So arbitrary and conventional is the nature of the connection between the two. Now, within the sign, and this is a similar point, what are signifiers and signifieds comprised of? What makes that a T?
Convention.
Okay. What could what's that?
Contents.
Well, for instance, it can be different sizes.
Dark will be across instead.
Right. It can be different colors. And we always recognize it as a T.
Shape.
An image or something.
How about this?
It's upside down.
Arguably, right? Arguably, maybe. It may also be a plus sign, right? Or a cross, that could be a cross too. But when we get to that point, it's like, well, okay, it could be an upside down, it could be an upside down T. But like that doesn't look like a T. Why not? What's changed? Is it that a T is two horizontal lines intersecting perpendicularly, such that from 10 degrees down to 40 degrees down? Saussure's answer is going to be no. What makes that thing a T is that it's not everything else. All it needs to be is distinguishable from everything else in order to function as a T. This is where he'll say the signifiers and signifieds independently are constituted by differences without positive terms. There is no positive quality of T, or rather, its positive quality is simply a residue of its perpetual differentiation from every other letter and every other mark, right? So you have now a system of language in which there is no intrinsic meaning to the letter T or to the word tree or to the, right? There's nothing intrinsic to it. You have only a perpetual movement of differentiation. What makes it tree is that it's not free, or breed, or cree, or tree, you know, like an infinite number of other things. Okay? So meaning, in that sense, doesn't inhere in the signifier in that case. Where does it inhere? Where is it? By the way, we didn't cover this. The signified is also constituted by differences without positive terms. Thought images are also constituted. In other words, we're not just talking about letters and languages here. And I'm not doing strict Saussure. I'm doing Saussure with some slightly more contemporary modulations, starting now. Differences without positive terms. What does that mean? That means there's no intrinsic chairness. What makes this a chair is that it's not the floor or the table or a human or an elephant or, again, an infinite series of other things that it's not. So if you want to find out what something is, what you have to do is you have to find out everything it's not, which, by the way, is infinite, which means you can't do it. Right? You can't finish it. You never get to finally trade a signifier for a meaning. What, in fact, you're always doing is trading signifiers for what will become another signifier. The perfect illustration of this is the dictionary. When you want to find out what a word, when you want to find out what a word means, you look it up. What do you find in it? Other words. And you think, I've gotten to a meaning. I can stop now. But of course you haven't, right? You've gotten to other signifiers. They are functioning as a stopgap for you. You are allowing them to prevent the continual proliferation of signifiers, and that's fine, there's nothing wrong with that. But what you've effectively done is say these words are somehow functioning more clearly, differently. They allow insight into an idea or a meaning that this word didn't. Because in practice, if you're going to take the play of signification seriously, as someone like Bart will do, as we won't see in this class, you look up the words in the dictionary, you find other words, then you have to go look them up, and then you find other words, and then you have to go look them up, and then you find other words. And so you're effectively, you never get out of trading signifiers for signifies. Right? You're never finally done. You stop doing it sometimes, but you're never finally done. You never get to a point of meaning. You never get to what they're now call like a transcendental signifier that is outside of the system that stops the play of signifiers. Instead, what you're doing is perpetually trading. Now, of course, you might look up the word and there's a picture there. Fine. That's another image, right? Notice, these are images. You're trading some kinds of images for other kinds of images. So you're not actually trading in a word for an idea. You are just trading in a word for another word, for another word, for a thought image, for a sound image, right? So, and this is Bart's version, is that what this means is that meaning is structurally indeterminate. It can never stop. This will explain why, for instance, after 500 years of people doing readings of Shakespeare, we still have new ones. Right? Not because we're smarter and we're fine. I mean, this is how everyone will argue. I mean, everyone will be like, well, those guys are fucking morons. My version is smarter, you know? And not because we're smarter, because of the structure of how language operates. As a process of infinite deferral, never present. Right? Meaning is never there. It's always just around the corner. I always think this is like, this you should think of as the X-Files. The truth is out there. Tune in next week. Right? The promise that just around the corner, it's going to be there. Because it will. But it's the next corner. Right? But it's perpetually the next corner. It's this sort of infinite play.